Hello. This is Computer Girl, from the song Computer Girl. Christian and Monte re-recorded their interview for this revised episode 3. Enjoy a slightly better listening experience. Humans remain fallible.
It's not too difficult to discover groups who are just beginning long and shiny careers, but how about discovering a group that is a total failure? An accomplishment indeed. Also, where can I get a bunk bed for my 2 English Springer Spaniels? Dance, goddammit, it's all you ever think about is Sparks. Thanks for clicking play. This is All You Ever Think About is Sparks, the only and therefore best podcast about the band Sparks on the internet. I'm your host, Christian Huey. And the next couple of episodes, we'll be following Ron, Russell, and the boys in Halfnelson on their journey to being a signed rock band and ultimately finding enlightenment and thenceforth earning the new name Sparks. This episode has 2 parts. Part the first, I relay more of the Sparks saga to you, dear listener, myself. And in part 2, I'm proud to present what will hopefully be the first of many interviews with Monte Mallin, host of his own podcast, So Important, as well as the author of the Sparks Drummer Project. Today, he's going to be talking mostly about Harley Feinstein with us, who was Sparks drummer for their first 2 officially released albums for Bearsville Records. Most of the words that you heard me say at the cold open were written by Los Angeles-based journalist Kathy Orloff. And I'm going to get into the doggy beds. That article contained the first and only interview Halfnelson had given for publication in 1970. Despite the inauspicious lead paragraph, Orloff goes on to proclaim herself a fan of the band in her October 17th article for UK music zine Sounds. Somewhat inelegantly, but still well-intentioned, she even declares Halfnelson to be, quote, underground favorites of the recording company Underground. As measured as the article was in its support, it was a feather in Halfnelson's cap, and they would immediately add the article to their press package, with the copy proudly taped to the wall next to their myriad rejection letters in their home away from home, the North Hollywood Doggy Bunk Bed Factory. Yes, you can take the boys out of the joke shop, but you cannot keep the joke shop out of the lives of the Mail brothers. Their rehearsal space at that time was indeed a working factory that manufactured beds for pooches. In an act of uncommon magnanimity, one of their bass players, short-lived, known only as Neil, whom Ron and Russell hired and quickly fired, allowed the boys to use his father's workplace as a rehearsal space when parts of it were not in use. The Doggy Factory would serve as Halfnelson's de facto headquarters, in between gigs at delicatessens and high schools and even one highly improbable Mormon dance event. It was where they performed for the record execs who were curious enough to take the time to come and see what this quirky act was all about. Most prominently, it was the space where weirdo rock wonderkind Todd Rundgren, that's all hard to say, decided to stake his reputation as well as the dollars of the record company that employed him on Halfnelson. The band at that time was comprised of 2 sets of brothers and drummer Harley Feinstein. Russell had long since, of course, decided definitively that he would hand over bass guitar duties to a hired hand, and that was Earl's exceptionally talented younger brother Jim. He was so talented, in fact, he was by all accounts a more accomplished guitarist than Earl, but Earl leveraged his older brother status by forcing Jim to play a different instrument. Rundgren agreed to an invitation by Mike Burns to attend a musical showcase at the Doggy Factory, where Halfnelson would perform to an audience of 4. To their embarrassment and dismay, Halfnelson had to reschedule at the last minute the first planned showcase for Rundgren and Company due to Feinstein's broken arm. But the rescheduled performance went without a hitch. Rundgren brought along engineer and later Sparks producer James Thaddeus Lowe, as well as Rundgren's girlfriend Christine and Lowe's wife Pamela. It is unknown whether it was Rundgren himself or Miss Christine of the Zappa-affiliated all-girl band the GTOs, and yes, the Miss was part of her handle, who was the most convinced of Halfnelson's potential. But one thing that soon became known was that Miss Christine and Russell Mael were having a dalliance of their own at the time. Indeed, as time went on, Miss Christine ended up favoring Russell's charms over Todd's, although thankfully, this didn't seem to keep a record from getting made. Love triangles aside, Bearsville Records via Rundgren and Lowe were intrigued by Halfnelson's demo record, and they wanted to see what the band could do live. Lowe and his wife were already fans of the song Roger, which they considered the highlight of the demo record Bearsville received from Halfnelson. Lowe was especially keen to hear newer material that might be of a piece with it. He was not disappointed by either the quirkiness of the new songs nor the band's showmanship in that private concert. These are some of Lowe's own words at the time. They were a bit nervous at first, but when they went into the set, they just hit it. There's no way to play Halfnelson music tentatively. You are committed as soon as the first falsetto note comes out of the singer's mouth. This was like a trip to another world. My God, it was all as weird as Roger. And it wasn't just about the music. Halfnelson put on a full theatrical experience. They adorned spacey costumes. Russell sang a ballad, Slow Boat, on a giant papier-mâché boat on wheels. They even added pre-recorded audience noises, cheering them on, and they had a fake concession stand. Also, the endless rehearsals had definitely paid off. The private concert was a smash. The only thing left to do was to convince the label's head, Albert Grossman, of Halfnelson's commercial viability. Luckily for the band, Grossman had trusted Rundgren's instincts implicitly. Grossman himself was a fairly big dog in the music industry, having managed Bob Dylan and having recently signed Foghat, who, although they weren't huge yet, they of course would go on to score a massive hit for the label with Slow Ride in 1975. Grossman never knew exactly what to make of Halfnelson, but he did eventually relay to the boys rather pointedly what he thought stood in the way of them and international success. It was the name. It was too wrestly, not catchy enough. Never mind Russell's insistence that Halfnelson was a reference to an exotic Japanese sex act, not true. To Grossman, the chief draw of the band was their humor, or so he told them after a few dinners in upstate New York at a nice Szechuan place. After the first Halfnelson record failed to catch fire, he urged them to change their name to something that would channel their wacky side. Grossman seemed to be a fan of the Marx Brothers, and he saw some similarities. So, in a classic example of the raw uncreativity of clueless industry execs, Grossman offered up the moniker Sparks Brothers. Although the band, of course, thought it was too cute by half, they acquiesced, and by the time of the re-release of the album a year later, they were initially advertised as the Sparks Brothers, soon shortened to Sparks as a compromise. Grossman and Rundgren agreed when they signed Halfnelson in late 1970 that what they needed was a brand new album to put out, something with professional polish, which the band was happy to do. What they were less happy about was Grossman's insistence that they dump their friend and manager Mike Burns for old-school cigar-chomping Hollywood heavyweight Roy Silver. Silver was an intimidating presence, but he did start landing real gigs for the band. Halfnelson also became increasingly annoyed with their recording sessions with Rundgren. The sessions seemed to stretch on forever, as Ron later related. Sure, Rundgren had similar musical interests, but the band felt he was pushing too many of his own ideas onto the proceedings. It was a case of too many cooks. By accounts, Rundgren was nice enough and plenty professional, but he was also riding a wave of critical adulation for his 1970 album Runt, and he felt the need to put his imprimatur on everything he produced. Ron, for his part, would later cop to pushing back on Rundgren a bit too aggressively, which discouraged their producer from showing up a whole lot in the later sessions. James Lowe, who picked up the slack when Rundgren wasn't around, later offered the narrative that Rundgren simply found himself spinning too many plates at once and just didn't have the time or the energy to devote to Halfnelson once the ball really got rolling in the studio. At any rate, Lowe was as impressed, if not more so, with Halfnelson's off-kilter sound and subject matter, and showed himself to be a skilled hand at the decks and a nice guy to boot. Halfnelson was finally released on Bearsville with 12 songs on the record. Just 2 tracks from the 1969 demo album made the transition, but a much stronger and confident, still plenty weird set of songs took their place. Let's take a closer look at the songs of Halfnelson, shall we? A 9-note guitar riff sounding like the waddle of a lost duck is the opening salvo of Halfnelson's first official album. At least I think it's a guitar. Wonder Girl is so un-rock and roll, so pedestrian and staid even on its surface. It takes a couple of listens to realize how ballsy a choice it is for the lead single on an unknown band's debut album. Wonder Girl sounds like the way Ron Mael looked on stage in 1971. Like there's an inner voice instructing its subject to keep it together, dude, at least for the next 3 minutes. The unofficial, by now, video for the song, a live quote-unquote performance on German television from 1972, shows the band pantomiming to the music, as was the style at the time, while a herd of white Euro teens, who seemingly are given instructions to dance and then freeze at appropriate moments in the song. The term dance here is used loosely, but to be fair, Wonder Girl was never designed to be a disco hit. In the video, we see a rough draft version of Ron and Russell's trademark visual presentation with some early differences. Wearing a conservative suit and tie, Russell mugs, eyes forever agog, with curly locks cascading over his shoulders. Ron, pre-haircut, looks like Russell's evil twin, with goth eyeliner to boot, but with his mainstay toothbrush mustache present in all its whimsical/unsettling glory. And while Russell is bug-eyed in a welcoming sort of excitement, Ron sneers and glares at the camera each chance he gets. And thus, the good twin-evil twin dynamic was minted, and they would keep these basic onstage personae to this very day. Wonder Girl is a severely disciplined tune, and in retrospect, you can hear the seeds of new wave planted here, but it frankly must have been kind of a shock to hear in a year when maximalist rock bands like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath were marrying blues with Wagner. For young people to hear music that sounded like, I don't know, B.J. Thomas having a psychotic episode coming out of their car's new stereo speakers. The arrangement on this song is miles away from the Syd Barrett psychedelia of their abandoned demo album, and one has to wonder if the single's brutal minimalism was calculated for maximum impact. Each member of the band is given the barest minimum of instructions here. There are no solos, no drum fills, and even Russ's falsetto is remarkably restrained. The song works amazingly well as a pop tune, no doubt because of its clear-eyed straightforwardness, at least musically so, and it has a French cabaret vibe to it that would pop up countless times in Sparks' catalog. It's an appetizer, but also a palate cleanser for the rest of the album that precedes. Lyrically, Wonder Girl is one of Ron's early explorations of frustrated adolescent lust. There's not a whole lot of the lyrical playfulness, or at least that sense of, oh, I see what he did there, that Ron's best lyrics trigger, but there's plenty to like about understated lines like, she was there, and I was pretty glad about that too, knowing that she knew a thing or two. Ned Raggett of AllMusic Guide wrote decades later about the song, arguably, the rest of the brothers' career has been a continual refinement from Wonder Girl's basic formula. Track 2 is Fala Fali. It's another Ron song. I really like this song's driving rhythm. It sounds like an early use of the Motorique beat, courtesy, of course, Harley Feinstein, the drummer. This beat would go on to form the bedrock of the krautrock phenomenon with the likes of Neu! And Can, Kraftwerk. The band is given more to do on this song for sure than it is on the opening track Wonder Girl, with plenty of playful keyboard work from Ron, So check out the charge song, if you will, near the end, and some great fretwork from bass player Jim Menke. The lyrics? Well, they seem to tell a story about brother or sister incest. Oh, Ron, you cad. Moving on. Track 3 is Roger. This is one of only 2 holdovers from the Halfnelson demo album. Roger looked for a couple of years there to be the band's likeliest shot at scoring a hit single, despite how weird, or maybe because of how weird it sounded. It's a rare Russell-penned song, and it's not crystal clear to me what the lyrics are about, but one reading could be that it's that of a wealthy man asking his accountant, say the titular Roger, how best to divvy up his riches in his will. Any rate, Roger was an early favorite of the band's, as well as Todd Rundgren and his production team, and here is where we can hear the band Syd Barrett's obsession from a few years ago find its full flower. There are time signature changes aplenty, call and response, melodic lines, and some downright wacky sound effects and some sonic treatments courtesy Earl Menke. Then we have High C. Here's where fans of Sparks' glam era can really hear those humble beginnings. High C is a driving piano-bass rock number in a minor key with a lot of 16th notes. But in keeping with the band's musical habits at the time, the song veers without warning into a playful doo-wop vocal interlude, and several key changes and time changes throughout. The song showcases some of Ron's more enjoyable lyrics of the period. Example, since you left the opera, you just frown a lot and mumble, I'm humble, as the narrator serenades a retired opera singer of whom he's an obvious fan. Then we have fan favorite Fletcher Honorama, another fan favorite. Ron's pulsing organ starts out Fletcher Honorama, and Harley Feinstein matches with an alternating clack and somber cymbal hit, methodically building on this rhythmic structure throughout the song. This is a moody minor key number. It sounds like a dirge or a requiem. It sort of is a pre-requiem for a guy named Fletcher who has decided to hold a televised wake before his death. There is the line, telecast in 50 states and brought to you by Anti-Wrinkle-Dew. Russell croons on this one as the narrator acts as a master of ceremonies in the celebration of the life of the well-known 80-year-old Fletcher. Russell's narrator reads briefly from his will, which mentions Fletcher's living twin, and takes time in the middle of the show to play some of Fletcher's favorite songs. At this point in the song, the band takes us into sort of a dream sequence, and Ron's piano channels like an old Tin Pan Alley or music hall ditty that never was, sounding a lot like a lost Scott Joplin number. When the band takes us back to the present, they build to a crescendo, with Russell's TV presenter character admonishing everyone involved in the production to be sure that the boy don't die by morn, which he repeats ad infinitum. The last song on side 1 is Simple Ballet. Simple Ballet sounds as advertised. It's a bracing waltz number with heavy emphasis on Ron's piano, punctuated by Feinstein's occasional cymbal crashes. About halfway through the song, a small choir of mini Russells show up to back Russell's own lilting falsetto. Now, Ron's lyrics here are starting to show their brand. There's a simple what-if supposition that leads to verses and a chorus of then this and then that, and finally something entirely foreseen, which is really enjoyable. In Simple Ballet, the idea is that ballet is the next big fad to hit the masses. Although the character being sung to somehow gets himself into legal trouble near the end, it's not clear to me why. And that is the end of side 1. Side 2 begins with a really unusual song for the band. Now, side 2 starts out with an unusual song for the band. Slow Boat is easily the most normal song in the Halfnelson canon, if not the Sparks canon. It has a simple lyric about a love lost, simple imagery about the titular slow boat sailing the narrator away from the object of his wasted affections. This was the time of ballad AM radio, and it was a wash in songs similar to this in sound and theme in 1971. Think about Let It Be or Bridge Over Troubled Water. Now, despite some embarrassment by the band about how straight, maybe even mawkish the song sounded, Russell believed the song could have been a hit were it not for their record company's indifference. Also, whether an ironic gesture or completely sincere, Russell would perform Slow Boat live wearing a sailor suit and from a papier-mâché boat on wheels pulled to the stage by stagehands. And then we have Biology 2. If the inclusion of the mainstream-sounding Slow Boat embarrassed the band, then they more than make up for it with the follow-up track Biology 2, which is a rare non-male song contributed by Earl Mankey. Mankey really lets his musical influences take the spotlight here. His lead vocals, though it is Mankey who is singing lead, are pitched up at least an octave, sounding like a Randy Chipmunk as he grunts and croons about sex via its connection to meiosis and gene selection. And musically we have halting, mostly arpeggiated lines that alternate on guitar and then keyboard, and that sort of frames this intentionally bonkers song that very well could have been an inspiration for the later novelty hit Fish Heads by Barnes & Barnes. It was the last Mankey would get to channel his inner Frank Zappa, unfortunately, at least as a member of Sparks/Halfnelson. It was also, weirdly enough, the first Halfnelson song to receive any airplay on local radio in Los Angeles, much to Russell's chagrin. Then we have the only other holdover from the Halfnelson demo album, Saccharine and the War, and one of just 2.5 songs written by Russell. Now, the version here loses some character in the Rundgren version from the original demo version, but it does rock harder after the first verse. As Russell described in an interview, the song is about the religious fervor encouraged in women by society to lose weight. And this was in 1971. Descriptions of a cross and a crucified doctor, which raises the question, did this doctor suffer for their perceived sins of being fat? It all brings home Russell's point in a pretty provocative fashion. Next we have Big Bands. This is another song that reached back generations for its musical inspiration. This is another mini-epic that pulls together at least 5 disparate musical sections. The song references Herbert Hoover again and again and again. Bizarrely, fascinatingly, it features a Middle 8 proto-rap by Russell about 3.5 minutes in. And generally the song sets things up for the big rock number trademark that closes out the album, which is No More Mr. Nice Guys. Now, I know what you're probably thinking, and although he hasn't said so himself publicly, this is possibly where Alice Cooper got the idea for his 1975 hit. No More Mr. Nice Guys is that big rock number that points the way forward for Sparks' glam days soon to come, mining Ron's seemingly endless well of sexual frustration and the condemnation of what we now call toxic masculinity, very common theme with Ron's lyrics. Nice Guys finishes out the album with a bang and finally gives Earl Mankey a chance to really shred on his guitar. There was originally meant to be a 13th song, which was left off for unknown or unspoken reasons. That would have been Jim Mankey's only solo credit, plaintive song called I'm an Old Retired Man. Now, I myself have not heard the song, so if anyone listening has ever come across a recording of it, let me know. Maybe the others in the band thought that this song was too similar in theme to Fletcher Honorama and it got the axe. Don't know. The album would have 2 releases under 2 different names. They also had 2 different covers. The original Halfnelson album cover was a work of some pretty innovative pre-photoshopping skills on the part of Larry DuPont, based on an idea by Ron. Now he took a magazine ad by GM for their 1969 Oldsmobile that shows a glamorous woman reclining in the back seat. And then he superimposed the head of each band member onto the car windows, which kind of gives the impression of these 5 long-haired ruffians leering at this poor, unsuspecting lady. The original composition was in black and white, and DuPont artificially tinted parts of the image, which, to my eyes, does add some playfulness. By the way, the ad photo, I did read, was used with GM's permission. They did seek GM's permission and received it. For the re-release, the 1972 re-release of the album under the Sparks name, there was another band photo, a simpler photo, again in black and white, that graces the foreground with a red brick wall as a backdrop. Apparently, Ron was nursing a fascination with brickwork at the time. Having the backing of an actual record label paid huge dividends by the time the band was rechristened as Sparks in 1972. Bearsville decided to release Wonder Girl as a single in July. Remarkably and esoterically, the song caught on big in Montgomery County, Alabama, and fought for the top of the charts alongside Gary Glitter's now legendary as football chant, Rock and Roll. Soon, the same thing happened in Fargo, North Dakota, and Sparks found themselves playing their first gigs out of state. They even scored their first appearance on American Bandstand, where Mr. Normie himself, Dick Clark, would welcome Ron and Russell back again and again over the years. Before heading back into the studio to record album number 2, Sparks had a disastrous experience surrounding a show in Houston. Their rental car broke down in the Mojave Desert, leaving the band stranded until a truck of Mexican tourists saved the day. Later, there was a torrential downpour that made the Texas highways impassable, and finally, although they did manage to play the show in Houston, Russell suffered a concussion on stage with a wooden mallet that appears to be a mishap which was entirely his own fault. Still, if 1971 was a good year for Halfnelson, 1972 was an amazing year for Sparks. They finally felt like they were on their way to realizing their old manager and friend's 3-year-old prediction, "This group is gonna make it. I'm tired of being called a lunatic."
Hello. This is Computer Girl, from the song Computer Girl. Wow. Ron and Russell's story just keeps getting more and more interesting. Of course, all your bizarre human habits are interesting to me. You know what else is interesting? Checking out our Facebook page at facebook.com/podcastsparks, or emailing the show at podcastsparks@gmail.com. Coming up, Christian's interview with Monte Mallin. Don't forget to listen to Monte's podcast. So important. And read his blog at montesnewblog.blogspot.com. That's Monte spelled Monte.
This is Christian, and you are listening to All You Ever Think About Is Sparks, the podcast, and I have with us today Mr. Monte Mallin. Monte Mallin, a friend of the podcast, has been very generous with his time and attention. He's really helped me get my wings with this podcast, and he is going to talk a little bit about a couple of projects that he has himself. One, the most important in regards to this show, of course, would be the Sparks Drummers project. And before we get into that, Monte, I just want to ask you, when did you first hear Sparks, the band? When did you discover a love for them? What's your origin story?
Well, first of all, Christian, thank you so much for having me as your guest. I'm really looking forward to talking. I love your podcast.
Thank you.
And as far as my origin story, it's probably the same as lots and lots of other people who are about my age, which is hitting 60. And I saw them back in 1974 on one of the late-night rock shows that they had back then. It was Don Kirshner's rock concert, and just before that, it was the Midnight Special. And the second time I saw him was the Kirshner show, and that's when I saw it, and I just said, this is the best thing I've ever seen or heard. And really, I have a lot of groups that I like, but they still have a very special place in my heart.
Right.
There's still nothing quite like them, and it's just been so much fun following them, and and it just grew into a love affair, going all the way back to the 70s.
Yeah, and you're right. I have heard that story, a similar story from a lot of people of your generation. I'm a little younger. I just turned 40, but I've talked to Sparks fans of every age, and there's a similar sense of having of making this great find. Like there's nothing quite like their style and their presentation. And I think it really speaks to their durability, that they're able to have this effect on new generations of fans all the time. So this was... go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say absolutely. And, you're watching it when you're a 14-year-old kid. And, at that time, I was listening to Aerosmith and the Rolling Stones, and that was the stuff I was listening to and enjoying. And all of a sudden, these guys come on with this kind of awkward lead singer, but going all out, giving everything he's got.
Yes.
And this guy on the keyboards,
right.
With these crazy looks and the whole thing that Ron did. And it's just, what is going on here? And then you start to look into it a little bit more, and you find out more about them, and you start getting their past records, and you realize this is really, something is going on here.
Yes, yeah, I had the same experience. Yeah, it's very, very, very striking. And, well, one thing that really spoke to me was, like you were talking about, you've got Russell and Ron. They don't slot into anyone's idea of traditional coolness. If anything, it was anti-cool in a way, but it's just so strong in their own unique kind of presentation.
Oh yeah, I mean the presentation was everything, and at that time, you don't know that they went to film school or that they were all these other things, that they had this big interest in movies and presentations and all of this stuff. You just see it, and it's like, what is going on here?
Right.
And just for the record, the first album I bought new was Indiscreet. And I remember there was, it's one of the best. And there was a record store in Pittsburgh. They knew me by then because I bought all the previous 4 albums from them. I was in there all the time buying the singles. That's what we did in those days. And they had, when I came in, they just had this copy of Indiscreet behind the desk, and they said, "Here you go." And boy, I just took it home and said, "Wow, this is so different from the last two." And that was part of what made it so interesting to me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, from the moment you see that cover, and it looks like there's a plane crash on a little Cessna airplane, and Ron and Russell in states of disrepair and disarray. It catches your eye, and then from the moment you listen, and when I first heard it, I immediately was struck by the opening song.
Hospitality.
Hospitality on Parade. Yeah, exactly. But we'll get to that in due course on the show. So you yourself also have the Sparks Drummers Project. First off, you yourself are a drummer, right?
Yes.
And when did you start becoming a drummer? Or do you know?
Oh, that goes way back to the 1960s is when I started taking lessons. With a fellow named Babe Fabrizi, who is a Pittsburgh legend on the drums, but that's a long story too.
Well, that's great. So, did you what were your influences at that point?
Well, I started out then, and then in high school I was in the band, and it's really in high school when I picked it up again, and I was a Rolling Stones type drummer, and I listened to Charlie Watts all the time.
Yeah.
And that kind of style, that kind of groove drumming is still what I play today, which is very different from what Sparks do.
Yes.
There's an element of that, but they're not a groove, kind of a blues based or rhythm and blues based band in the least. They are their own sound.
Yeah.
But so they were always the outlier, and I just loved playing to those albums. I was not very good at it, but it didn't stop me.
So yeah, as you were saying, it's a really different style. In fact, it seemed like they were diametrically opposed to sounding like anything blues based or R&B. Regardless, you became a huge Sparks fan, and you decided to reach out to all of the various drummers of Sparks. And of course, if you know about Sparks and their band membership history, you understand that they have an almost Spinal Tap
spontaneous combustion.
Exactly, right. So
Right.
the lifespan of a drummer is fairly short, and of course, they've all had very, very different sounds. It's a very basic question.
Yeah.
Why did you embark on this project?
Well, it was around 2014, 2015, I believe, and I like a lot of the things. To me, social media is a mixed bag. There's positives and a lot of negatives, but there are some nice positives. And one of the great positives is it gives pretty much anybody a chance to express themselves in so many different ways if they want to do it. And I like that. I've always done that kind of. I've always written for school papers and found outlets for to do that kind of thing. And here I set up this blog, and I had this idea that wouldn't it be fun to try to interview every single one of those Sparks drummers? Mm-hmm. And I didn't get all of them, but I got most of them. And that was really it. I just thought this would be a really fun thing to do. And I was aware that it was creating a record. Mm-hmm. And it was just something that seemed like a worthwhile endeavor to me, just to hear what they all had to say about their experience with Ron and Russell. And
you had this chance to put together a canon of sorts. I mean, like you said, a record. And it sounds, when you had that idea, it must have seemed a little daunting. I mean, you didn't have any sort of personal or professional connection to any of these people. Were they fairly easy to get their contact information, and B, were they fairly approachable people?
Well, it's another thing about the internet and social media. It's really not that hard to track people down. Mm. And the first one that I talked to was Dinky Diamond, who was their drummers in the 80s. And I did track down a contact.
Dinky. He was, wasn't that the Island Years?
No, I'm sorry. The first one I talked to was David Kendrick. I apologize for that. It was David Kendrick, their drummer in the 80s, and I did find his contact, and I sent him an email, and he got back to me right away and said, sure, let's do this. And we had a tremendous talk, and so I thought, okay, maybe I can pull this off. Yeah. And the next one I talked to was Harley Feinstein, who's the drummer for the, right now you're looking at the first two albums, and he was the drummer on those two albums. And he had just come off of a extensive podcast that he did, and he was a little concerned that he wouldn't have anything particularly new to say, but in fact he had tons to say, and he was just a great pleasure to talk to.
Yeah, there are a lot of really cool little tidbits. I went back and reread your interviews with David and Harley and a few others. So going chronologically through, you start off, well, in chronology of the band anyway, you start off with Ronna Franks, and she's not very well known, to Sparks listeners, or I don't believe she's a musician today any longer. But you did decide to interview her, and that was pretty interesting too. And for those who don't know, she was a drummer only on the Urban Renewal project, correct?
Right. She worked with them, and she served them cookies and milk when they were done playing. And she was just thrilled about it. She sent me pictures. I think she really liked it because she could share it with her grandkids. I think she just loved doing it.
That's great.
Yeah, each one of them brought something special. But I would say this, that there were some commonalities among them, which made it really fascinating to me. I mean, they all had a great respect for each other, which is the first thing. They all knew each other's work, and they all held each other in high regard, and none of them would say that they felt they made the best contribution. It was always pointing to someone else. They held their time in Sparks in very high regard. They felt that was a great creative period for the most part. John Mendelsohn, who I talked to, did not share that view. That's perfectly fine. That's perfectly fine. But the third thing is they really had a lot of praise for Ron and Russell themselves. They really liked them and they felt like they grew by being with them in a lot of ways. And so overall, they all look back on it as a very positive experience.
That's great, and I definitely did get that impression from most of those interviews. As you said, with the exception of John Mendelsohn, from what I read, he maybe that. I mean, I know they had stylistic differences musically, but I think he was just personality-wise, they didn't really jibe very well. Is that what you would say?
I would say personality. I would say music. Although I think he enjoyed, I think he was, let's say music. But you know what I really think it was? I think he had the impression he was in a real band. And, and it was clear that with the Mankeys on board and with Ron and Russell, there's so many dominant personalities. And, after this period that you're looking at now, the Bearsville records, Ron and Russ have been very open that was the last time they were real democracy as a band. And so the trend was already in place. And I think he felt, there was other things he wanted to do. And I think that's perfectly fine. I want to add one thing about John. He's one of the funniest people on the internet. I don't know if people follow him or not, but he's just a really funny guy and really fun to talk to.
Well, I will definitely start following him. Now, he went on to be a founding member of John's Children, or was that before?
No, I think that came later, and I think I can't remember. I don't know too much about his history post Sparks, but I know that he was in a couple bands that he really enjoyed the experience, and of course he went on to be a writer at Rolling Stone magazine, and he had a very successful career there.
Oh wow, cool! I'll definitely have to check that out. So after John, of course, I know they had a couple of people in the drummer's seat for a very brief period of time. I think there was one that ended up being fired as their drummer, but they kept on as a manager or a publicist. Mike Burns, I think.
Mike Burns.
Right,
yeah.
Right, exactly. But he didn't, I don't know if he did much of distinction, frankly, as a drummer. But after that, of course, there was Harley, whom you've spoken with and who I've reached out to as well for an interview for this podcast. You want to briefly talk a little bit about your experiences speaking with Harley?
Well, absolutely. And basically, the real question is here is that this was a band in formation, right? Ron and Russell were still finding their way. The Mankeys were contributing songs and music, and they were still figuring out where they were going with all of this.
Right.
And it was clear that they were not going to be, a blues-based R&B type band, even though they thought they sounded like The Who from everything I've read, and the Kinks. That influence is there. But, they were clearly doing some new things. And I think that you hear that on the very first two records. There's some new things that they're doing. They're things that aren't normally done by a band putting out their very first record. This was nothing like just a regular pop record with 10 songs that sound similar and come in about 2.5, 3 minutes. This was a whole different kind of thing.
Yeah.
And the reason why I'm emphasizing that is because what Harley had to do was figure out what his role was in this band, and he had to figure out how to keep up with the kind of intricate arrangements that Ron was already putting together, even at that early stage of his career. So you will hear in a couple places where he's able to just keep a kind of a straight beat, like in a song like Wonder Girl. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, what you hear on those first two albums are songs that go all over the place, come back, logically conclude, and to where they started. They're very holistic, and he had to provide drums for that, and there was no template.
Right.
All the drummers who came afterwards had a template. He had to basically create the template of what it meant to be a Sparks drummer. To me, that is a fantastic achievement.
Right. I completely agree there. And also what you mentioned before about in the early stages of the band, there being a lot of strong personalities, not just Ron and Russell, but Earl. The more I listen, the more I do my research. Earl had a huge influence on those first couple of albums. And where does, this fifth wheel, where's this odd man out slot into all that? And I agree that he had the unenviable job of not only figuring out what a Sparks drummer sounds like, but also, how to, deal with all of these conflicting and really strong personalities. And also, like Ron and Russell, they seemed like they were uninterested, at least at first, in even having a drummer or having drums. If you, I listened to the so-called demo record several times, and there are a few tracks that have no percussion, or at least no real drums.
Well, maybe that was their view, but I'm glad they changed their mind on that.
Yeah, totally.
There's some moments where the drums add quite a bit to their music, and I think that one of the great talents is that they were able, because Ron did think in terms of these arrangements and how he wanted all the instruments to play and come in. I think they were able to really use drums to bring out some of the power of what they were trying to do.
How is Harley's drum approach and sound distinct from the other drummers in the Sparks Ovier?
I think you'd have to ask Harley what he thinks on that, but my feeling is that he was a little bit more of a power drummer. Mm-hmm. And I think that comes through on some of the tracks that you hear, like Do Re Mi, No More Mr. Nice Guy, Beaver O'Lindy, of course. There's some real accomplishments there, but you hear a certain power to it. What I think made him unique and appropriate for Sparks is that he knew when to channel it and when to hold back. If you listen to a song like Fletcher Honorama, there's a lot of he's holding back and creating kind of just a gentle jazz groove. If you listen to a song like Big Bands, which is on the first album, he keeps up with this arrangement that changes all over the place during the course of the song. And I think they all have. I'm sorry.
No, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but Big Bands in particular. I mean, that song is cobbled together in like a Frankenstein patchwork of different sonic parts, and he's doing all kinds of different stuff there. In fact, by the way, when later on I am going to slot in portions of the songs that we're talking about, I'm pulling these from your own curated collection of Sparks drummers that you shared with me on Spotify.
Is this a good time to give that a plug?
Absolutely.
Okay, I did just for you and your listeners. I put together a drum list, a curated collection of Sparks drums of songs. All right, a curated collection of songs that I feel really have a benefit from great drum parts, either done organically in the course of the by the band, or when Ron and Russ were in more of an electronic era. I think where they did a really great job of the programming to bring out the song. And I will make that available to you. And if you please spread it, and I hope people will listen to it. And I really thought hard about which songs to put on there and to create something that brings out the variety as well as the quality of the drumming that they had throughout their career. They always have very high standards.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, it's a great collection. I've got it pulled up right here, and I was listening to it. And by the way, I do plan this to be the first of many interviews with you about about this project, because I read all the interviews, and I've got tons of questions about David Kendrick and Hilly Michaels, who played with them on Big Beat. And then I would love to ask you, I don't know if you ever got in touch with, if you were able to reach Keith Forsey, but that guy's drumming on that album almost makes it for me.
Okay, I don't know if you want to talk about that now or as opposed to later, but you've got me on one of my favorite topics.
Oh, so, what the hell?
What the hell, right. There was a post in Facebook a while ago from my good friend Paul Castro, where he said maybe they should have used electronic drums. And I said, Paul, I agree with you 85% of the time on stuff, but I got to respond to this one. The album we're talking about, just for the record, is number one in heaven.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and
to 1979 reinvention. Yeah,
1979 reinvention, exactly. And the drums, the drumming that Keith Forsey does on that is what, to me, puts that album over the top. As great as it is,
totally
having
agree.
the human drummer there is what puts it over the top. He's one of the two people I was not able to get in touch with. I tried and tried, and at a certain point, you just figure, okay, not going to happen. But I really wanted to talk to him because the drumming on that album is something so special, in my humble opinion. And I hope maybe someday I'll get to talk to him on my podcast or something. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, I sure hope you do. Yeah.
Well,
you come back to again and again and again.
Yeah, but you move on in life, and I'm not really pursuing it actively at this point. But the drumming on that brings out the music in a way that I think that's what my personal view as a drummer is, that's what puts that whole album over the top.
I mean, it gives it a pulse, literally. It's the blood of that album. Well, we'll get into that one as well.
All right.
But Harley Feinstein. So I went back and listened. Of course, I've been listening to the first two albums a lot for where I am in the project right now. And I read him describe his sound as being more tom-tommy. He's not as, say, crashy as David Kendrick described himself as being. And I definitely hear a lot of that. And there's a lot of... Sometimes it sounds intentionally primitive or constricted.
Well, I think...
But I'm not a drummer.
Yeah, I mean, I think Harley was doing what the music called for, and that's not always easy. And then you had people who were producing these, like Todd Rundgren, who was a very strong personality and had certain things that he wanted. And I think Harley was still trying to define his role at that point. Yeah. So maybe he was a little bit primitive, but I think that he's also... I tend to look at the positive side, which is that he really was able to work with all these producers, work with Ron and Russell, and like you said, all the personalities.
Yeah.
And he was able to come up with something, and I think the power that he has really comes through on some of those songs, especially on the second album.
Right. Yeah. I again. So now I'm listening to Woofer and Tweeter's Clothing, and there's a lot more variety there. I feel like he's really had a chance to exercise some muscles that he didn't have the opportunity for in that first album. And Wonder Girl in particular, it is. Again, I want to use the word primitive, and I don't mean that in a negative way. It's just very controlled. And it's simple. I read also recently, today even, I believe, that he was playing to a tape delay that James Lowe had set up for him. So there's a weird kind of echo to it, but it's also a very basic beat, and he doesn't stray too much from it. And that kind of control really made for a really interesting single, and not at all like the kind of rock and roll that you were hearing in 1971.
Oh, no, not at all. And I think that just, sometimes that's all you need to do. And I think it was wise of Rundgren and the band and Harley to not overdo it. And sometimes subtlety can play. Sometimes drummers forget the importance of subtlety.
Right.
And, and I think it's to his credit that he did take a very subtle role on some of those songs. But I think you also see on Fala Fali and a few of the others that we already talked about, like Big Band, that he could do a lot more when called upon to do a lot more. So I think he was very tasteful, and I give him a lot of credit for that.
I completely agree. Yeah, I want to talk about Fall Off Ali because when
you mean the words?
Well, there's that. I don't know what the hell it means. And by the way, I also read in your interview with him that he was. He was not dismissive, but he would be, when you asked him about Ron's lyrics, he said, I don't know, someone would say something in rehearsal one day, and he'd come back the next day and have a whole song about that phrase.
Right.
Which was really funny to me.
Yeah.
But Fall Off Ali, which does have some interesting lyrics, it does appear to be about an incestuous sibling relationship.
It very much appears to be about an incestuous sibling relationship. Yes.
But lyrics aside, what really got me was the drumming in that song, because it sounds to me, I'm a fan of krautrock, and bands like Can at that time, or actually a few years later, or No, or Noi, however it's pronounced, and even some early Kraftwerk. It sounds to me like the Motorique beat. I don't know if you made that connection.
No, I don't really. That's very interesting. Though I'll listen to a little bit of it. No, it's not new music I normally do listen to. So that's very intriguing.
Yeah, it was interesting to me when I heard it because I thought it sounded very German and a little and very much ahead of its time. Yeah, I would definitely go back and listen to especially Can around that time. I thought it sounded a lot like it. So I'm looking at your playlist again, and I've got Fletcher Honorama. That's definitely a big fan favorite, Fletcher Honorama. Is there anything in particular that strikes you about what Harley's doing on that song?
No, but again, I think it's just the tastefulness of it. It's just a nice, simple backbeat, almost a jazz feel, and very, very much in tune with the song itself. Yeah. And that's why I included it, because a lot of the ones on the list tend to be some of the rockers, and they have, kind of the big drum parts. But I think it was important to show how, the playing could be subtle as well, and how wonderfully precise he was in that. And so I wanted to make sure he got his just kudos for that.
Just kudos, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of that song as well. And then, of course, we have No More Mr. Nice Guys, which you mentioned a little bit earlier, which has that big end of the record, big rock move there. He really gets to thrash on that one. And then you have Big Bands, which we discussed as well. And then from the Woofer and Tweeters Clothing album, we have Beaver O'Lindy.
Yeah. Now, let me just make a comment about that one. I mean, this is, where you start to see Ron really playing with the arrangements in some interesting ways, because basically there's no drums for the first half of the song. Mm-hmm. And then he just announces himself with this tremendous single stroke roll. One of my all-time favorite single stroke roll. It's just so powerful. And then drums are just killing it for the rest of the song. I mean, there's a couple places where there's no drums, but basically for the rest of the song, he's just killing it. And I thought that was something worth kind of listening to and just having some fun. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that too. I'll definitely be slotting that one in here. And then we have, you also have on here, Nothing is Sacred.
Yeah, and the comment I would make about that is I think this shows, I started to play it accidentally. Oops. I was looking at the list too, and I pressed play.
That's okay.
So if you hear a little music in the back, that now you know why. But with Nothing is Sacred, what I find so fascinating about that is the last half of the song, where I guess on purpose, but not only do you really get Russell's full-throated falsetto, I think for the first time on these two records, but they play with the tempo, and they just speed it up. And if you listen to his drumming, he goes from a regular drum beat to cut time, and he's just keeping up and pushing it. And it's just so much fun from my perspective as a drummer. It's fun to listen to how he's trying to keep up with the ever accelerating tempo of that song. I think he does a great job there too. I tend to think a lot of positive things when I hear this.
Yeah, so do I. Yeah. It's again, he's just has so much control over his tempo.
Yeah. And then the last one that I have is Do Re Mi, and if you want an example of Harley on the tom-toms, I don't think you can get a better one than that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's just so much fun to listen to.
It is a lot of fun. I've wondered, again, it's fun to listen to, but I wondered why they decided to even record that, include that on the record. It's just such an off-the-wall choice. I mean, it's Rodgers and Hammerstein, wasn't it?
It's better than Fingertips.
It's better than Fingertips. Okay, yeah.
Right.
I'm with you there. I mean, I love listening to it. I mean, I didn't think you could take Do Re Mi to those extremes.
Right.
But it's a great collection, and then of course, as it goes on, we get into the Come On to My House and Propaganda and Discreet, and it goes through Big Beat with Hilly Michaels, and then of course all the way to the most recent stuff with
Steve Nestor. Yeah. Steve Nestor and company. Yeah, and I know you want to hold off on talking about all that. That's great. But yeah, I try to really list, try to do it comprehensively, but these aren't necessarily my all-time favorite Spark songs either, by the way. I mean, but I really tried to keep it focused on what I was trying to do for your listeners and also for me. I listen to it all the time.
Yeah, me too.
So,
especially lately.
Yeah, that's true.
That's kind of all I've been hearing. Like, my fiance is sick of hearing Sparks around the house. She's a good sport.
Well, I listen to, believe it or not, I listen to when I'm driving with my wife, and we've had to make a lot of road trips lately for some family reasons, and I have another set list of all my favorite country songs. And my wife is very, very patient, but I notice after about 45 minutes or so, she gets a little fidgety, and I say, "Okay, time to move on from the country songs."
Yeah. Well, I live in Texas, so I hear that coming from all sides. Yeah.
How far are you near Austin?
I'm in Austin.
Oh man, that's one. I have a. Oh, this is off topic, and feel free to cut it from the conversation. But I have a goal of traveling to all the great U.S. music cities, and Austin is real high on my list.
We're definitely very, very proud of our heritage and our contributions as we see them to music culture. It's a good town, and it is a great music town. I agree, and I'm proud to be an Austin native.
You're an awesome Austinite.
Yeah, awesome, Austin. I appreciate it.
All right.
So I guess we'll take a couple of minutes to wrap up because we will spend plenty of time, getting into the albums for the Island years and after that in due course, pretty soon anyway. So this part of the saga, of course, ends with Ron and Russell with the Mankeys and Harley did a tour of the UK, correct? And then they all came back. And that's correct, right? All of the original band did go do a tour of the UK before coming back to California?
I believe that is correct, yeah.
And then
yeah. I'm not 100% sure if Ron and Russell came back and then went back or if they stayed.
Just stayed.
But that's correct. They did a big tour.
So then the Mankeys and Harley found out, I suppose unceremoniously, that they were no longer a part of the band, and I'm sure that was I'm sure that was difficult for them when they were feeling like they had some momentum as a band. Well,
I'm sure you're exactly right. The one thing I would say is that they all, not just Harley, but all the drummers, would love their time, and they weren't shocked when Ron and Russell went their own way. That doesn't mean they liked it, but they weren't shocked. And I remember one of the things that you'll see there is that I had it on the blog, by the way, is that I had a lot of conversations with some of the other people who played with them too. Like there's a long, extensive interview with Martin Gordon, and
bassist on Kimono, the Island Records, or maybe just Kimono.
Just Kimono,
yeah, okay,
and a couple of the others, and they kind of understood the dynamic. They realized over time, let's put it that way, the dynamics of the band. So I think when Ron and Russ went their own way, as they did repeatedly, I think that they weren't shocked by it,
right?
Even if they weren't happy about it.
Well, and I'm sure that each successive drummer understood the deal more and more. But regardless, that's good. I'm glad that Harley has fond memories of the time, and today he is a practicing attorney in the San Diego area. I'm just saying all this because I know it's public information.
Right.
And that you've had a couple of conversations with him, and I'm hoping that we'll have him on the show as well.
He still plays with a couple local bands too, by the way.
Oh, really?
So
okay.
He stays busy. Yeah.
But what do you know about that? Are they?
One of them is called Wag Halen. I don't remember the name of the other, but he just loves playing, and I don't know how active he still is, but he loves playing, and he has a couple local groups, and he plays in the area.
That's really fantastic. Like I said,
it is. It really is.
I hope to hear more from him about that. You have a podcast of your own, of course. Would you mind introducing that, just talking about that real quickly? Well,
sure.
Not be quick either. Take your time.
Well, no, I mean, yeah, you've given me a lot of time here, so I don't want to take too much of your time. Right. But it's called So Important with an exclamation point. It's available on pretty much all the major carriers. It's a small scale thing. I just like to talk to people who have an interesting story to tell. My basic thesis is that everybody has an interesting story to tell. Some people want to tell it, some don't. That's fine. But some people, you just talk to folks about things that they're doing, and it can be really fascinating. And there's quite a bit of music on there. I talked, for example, to a band called the Sweet Lizzie Project, and they are out of Nashville. But they came from Cuba a couple years ago. They were sponsored by Raul Malo of the Mavericks, or they were brought over by Raul Malo of the Mavericks. And they were the last Cuban band to get a work visa before the current administration clamped down. And they are fascinating to hear how they approach their music. And then there's people who talk about all kinds of other issues that are important to them. So if people want a link, I mean, it would be fine to share it. That would be great. But it's just something I do for a pastime.
Yeah, no, it's great. You've interviewed people from all different walks of life. I listened to a recent one where you had an interview with I don't know what his position was exactly, if it was a government position, but he had a lot of he studied the Cold War.
The fellow who discussed the U.S.-Soviet scientific cooperation.
The scientific cooperation. That's
it's something that I used to be involved in a few years back, and he wrote a book about it. And he'd been doing it for many, many years, and he just had wonderful stories. And we talked about why that kind of cooperation can be important. It's all over the board, which means that it doesn't have a natural audience, which is something I do think about now and then. If it was all about knitting and I could go out to the knitting community, it would probably be more successful by traditional standards of podcast success. But here's a new stitch we're going to discuss today.
Yeah,
I do this for fun. I do it in my spare time. I do it to try to let people bring their stories out, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
Well, that's great. Well, I'm happy you're doing it, and it's a lot of fun to listen to.
Well, thank you.
That's called So Important with an exclamation point. And the aforementioned Sparks Drummers Project, those are all on your blog, Monte's blog. Do you want to give the URL, the link for that?
Sure. It's Monte's new blog at .blogspot.com. I think that's what it is, but if you presented a link in your show notes, I think that would do it.
I think that's right, but I'll do if needed. Monte, I'm so glad that we were successful tonight, and we finally got an interview where the sound levels were where we wanted them to be, and I really appreciate your time, and I'm really looking forward to doing this again as we go forward in the Sparks catalog.
Well, this was great, and I really enjoyed it, and it's obviously a topic that both of us love talking about. So if I'm at your disposal, anything I can do to help, or I'm happy to do.
Awesome. Hey, thanks so much, man. You have a good night.
Okay, you too. Thanks again.
It kills yourself with